okay with that. Okay, so welcome. The students and I that are in this live session right now have just been kind of tossing around some ideas about how to maybe change these Friday sessions to make them a bit more useful for you. I had intended our Wednesday sessions to be very content, and oriented, where we're going to discuss certain things that we have found in the videos and the learning materials that are posted on either the History 10 or the History 20 class, depending on which session you're in. And then maybe going into a bit more detail or expanding on certain topics or discussing certain topics, and also an opportunity for students to ask questions, and either we discuss or hopefully I can help you with the answers or whatnot. And I think I'd like to keep those sessions for now. But for the Friday sessions, I had intended that we get together as a History 10 and History 20 class and have it more of an unstructured time for students to ask questions about assignments, about a specific event, about something that they maybe want a little bit more information on, or need a little assistance, or want a little assistance with, but they haven't been particularly well attended lately. And my view on this with regard to online learning is that you have set your goals for the class, and you know your learning style better than anyone, and you know what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. Frankly, I can't force people to come to the live sessions, but I want them to be useful. Okay, the time is here, and I want to make sure that students feel like they can attend and that they're welcomed, and that I'm here to do the best I can to help you with whatever piece of the course I can help you with. And thus far, the Friday sort of larger session intention is not working out all that well. So after discussing it with some of the students, I think I'm going to throw a quick survey out just to see how people feel about it. But I'm wondering if maybe a better approach might be for me to set aside some blocks of time during the week, and then set up a very, very simple calendar whereby you could just click on a link on the internet, and if you want to schedule a quick 20-minute meeting with me where we can discuss something that's very specific to what you're working on, on a specific event and a specific assignment day. I need a little bit more information about this, that maybe students would be a bit more comfortable with that one-on-one approach. Ideally in humanities, probably more so in English than in history, but there's definitely a benefit to getting together and talking in a larger group. But I can also sort of react to what I'm seeing and the attendance that these things are getting. And I just don't want it to be wasted time for you. I want you to make sure that you can get something out of it. So look for that survey. I'm just going to gather your thoughts, because I think you should be in control of a lot of this, because you need to tell me what's going to work best for you. But I'm wondering if maybe scheduling these quick little appointments that are one-on-one and very focused on what you're working on might be more effective for you than having a larger group session where where there's a bunch of topics and discussion, because that doesn't seem to be working all that well at this point. So I'll throw that survey out there, and we won't, likely, or depending on what feedback I get, make some changes to the way we do these Friday sessions. And it may be more of a schedule a little one-on-one time for me so that I can help you. I definitely think that there's value in synchronous communication, live communication. And ideally, it would be best if we could generate strong discussions within a larger group. But I think a lot of us who are doing online learning this year are finding that's difficult to accommodate with students' different schedules and their level of comfortability of talking in live groups where they likely don't know anybody else, and they haven't in person met me or sort of gotten to know each other. So I do want to make sure that these are meeting a need, and that they're not viewed as a waste of time or unnecessary. So I'll get some feedback on that from you, and then we might make some changes accordingly. This is for both the History 10 and History 20 classes. At the end of the day, I'm here to help you, and I want to help you meet your goals in whatever reasonable way I can. And true, the course can be completed using materials that are available, using the videos and the slides and external research. So it's certainly possible, if that's the way you like to learn best, to complete the course on your own, as long as you're sticking to the calendar and making sure you're doing a good job on these things. But I definitely recognize that there is value in one-on-one communication, and I want to try to structure that in the best, most efficient and effective method for you. So that being said, for the History 20s, I'm going to talk a little bit about World War One, and sort of like the first 4 or 5 months as we move deeper into the Great War and learning more about, the technology, the alliances, the political backbone, the economics of the war. And I've been watching that. I think I've probably mentioned this before, that this is a course and this is a subject area that I've not taught before. So I'm learning along with you, and it's been an interesting learning experience so far. I took a recommendation from another teacher, and there has been a post in the class website for a great YouTube series called The Great War, and it's long. Like there's a maybe a 9 or 10 minute episode for every single week of the war, which lasted 4 years. So there's a lot of videos, and I certainly don't expect you to go and watch all the videos, but you may want to go and find a certain week if there's an event that's of particular importance in World War One, like a Verdun or a Somme or something like that, and just go watch that one video that relates to that particular battle or that particular week if something really big happened. I think it's definitely worth your while to go in there and have a look at that one or two videos in that time period that those important events are coming. They're really well done. They're explained in very, very simple terms. Sure, there's a lot of names and dates and locations and things like that, and I don't think it's important anymore that anyone memorize a whole bunch of names and dates from history. We have access to all of the information that we need within 30 seconds with a quick Google search. So the ability to remember these things and memorize them is not as crucial as maybe it was when I was growing up before I had access to all this stuff. And if you wanted some specific details, you had to go to the library, get the particular encyclopedia, and it was a real pain, right? Well, obviously, it's a new generation, and you've got access to that information. So in history classes, that hopefully the emphasis has been shifted more away from memorizing to understanding what happened and why it happened, and then applying what we could learn from that moving forward, and critically analyzing why things happen, and the events that led up to certain situations, and why it's important that we understand the intricacies of diplomacy and the way that nations treat each other and why alliances are formed, and because these are things that we can learn from, and hopefully nobody, the war is not a good thing. I don't think there's anybody that, well, at least no sane person that believes that we should be fighting and killing people. That's I think most citizens would agree that that's just not a healthy society or a healthy way to approach society. Conquest and subjugation and enslaving people and exploiting them and exploiting their resources and taking over their land and erasing cultures and things like that. I don't think any reasonable human would say that that's what good people do. So we need to learn from these things, but we're also pragmatic enough. That means we're logical enough, and we're reasoned, we're well reasoned enough to understand that these things still happen today, and they happen all around the world. And the fact that we have more access to information, and that there's a lot of media that can record these events all over the world, doesn't seem to be stopping it. We still have huge conflict in multiple nations all over the world all of the time. People are still subjugated. People are still exploited. Lands are still pillaged for resources, and all the things that were happening back in the age of discovery in the 14, 15, 1600s. The lands may have integrated populations because we've been traveling and immigrating and emigrating for so long, but that still hasn't stopped. It still hasn't stopped nations from trying to exploit other nations. And look at this. We're 500-600 years later, and these things are still happening. And sometimes they have the potential to happen on global scale again, like World War I and World War II. There was an imminent threat of a global nuclear war in the 60s, and all the way through, I would say, up to the late 80s, early 90s. We refer to it as the Cold War, and it's something that we will be exploring. But the potential for these global conflicts is still very real, and more frighteningly so, our ability to kill people and basically use technology to destroy entire cities, entire nations, has scaled way up since the battle we're talking about, World War One. We could spend a lot of time looking at military technology in World War One and how it changed the way that war was conducted. And the videos that I'm watching in this Great War series do a great job of explaining how certain nations were kind of trapped in the 1800s with the way that they thought war should be conducted. Throwing a lot of people in a straightforward manner at the enemy, whereas say Germany, for instance, had really improved the technology of their weaponry. So that approach wasn't really all that effective anymore. In the early parts of the battle, for instance, the French were still operating under a principle where that the guns that were used prior to that took about 20 seconds to reload. They were one-shot guns, and you had to, reset powder and basically it took 20 seconds to reload the gun. So a lot of their military commanders were still thinking along the lines of fire a shot off, and now you got 20 seconds to move forward while you're reloading your gun to get another shot off. Well, the invention of the machine gun basically changed that. A German platoon could just set up a series of machine guns across open fields, and war typically was conducted in big open fields where you could charge, where you could have cavalry, where you could have guns and ammo, and basically take a whole group of soldiers and just kind of march them ahead and overwhelm the enemy. But Germany changed all that. It wasn't just Germany, but Germany probably did the best job of it by developing these new war technologies, by starting to look at tanks and these huge howitzer guns that could fire a shell 10 miles. That stuff didn't exist in that form and wasn't mobile, so you could move it where the battles are moving in the previous, say, 100 years. So it really changed the way things were done. Having a huge fortress in medieval times and even through the Renaissance, having a huge stone fortress with thick walls and moats and stuff like that was pretty effective defense back in the day, because the technology just didn't exist to blow down a castle made from stone blocks that were the walls could have been 6 feet thick. That didn't exist during that time. So all these castles and battlements were built that way. But with these howitzer guns, could literally fire a shell 10 miles, and still land with enough impact to destroy these stone walls. So no longer was that really an effective defense. So that's, on the defending side, it was no longer effective because you could attack from 10 miles away. In the old days, if you wanted to fire a cannon or something against the wall, you had to get it really close. And then if the enemy had to get really close, they were easy to kill. But if they're 10 miles away and firing a whole bunch of howitzers and shells, there's not much you can do about that. So on the defensive end, things changed pretty significantly. France wasn't prepared for that. On the attacking end, again, they're used to wide open battles and wide open fields with, you fire your shot, and then you move forward and you fire another shot, and eventually whoever's got more men than standing at the end wins. And the machine gun changed that because the Germans could just set up a line of machine guns across the open field. And as the French, I'm just using the French as an example, but there were other groups too, as the French are shooting and then taking 20 seconds and then reloading, the Germans are firing the entire time and they're just wiping them out. So it changed the history, or it changed the way that war was conducted in a very, very pivotal way. So it seems odd that we're talking about a war that's 100 years ago, where we're talking about how technologically advanced and superior they were. But really, if you compare it to the time before, it was a huge leap forward in technology for war. And we were talking about taking the battle to the air now as well. I mean, you had the first. This was the first time that nations were able to build airplanes with guns on them that could actually fly places. I mean, that didn't exist before. Flight hadn't been around that long. The Wright brothers were still, still tampering with their planes and things like that. So, these are things that changed. The British had the strongest navy in the world for hundreds of years, and they still had a very, very strong navy. But now things are happening in shipbuilding that are allowing other nations to catch up. The use of iron and the use of metals that are stronger than wood. Steam power, engines that can propel ships through the water in any direction. without having to use sails. The Germans developed submarines. They called them U-boats. So the U-boats that were submarines that could now go under the water, things that had never been used before, but now allowed nations to attack with greater firepower, with more mobility, with more access to other nations, whether it be across the land or through water or channels or what have you. So it really was a big step up in terms of technology. And then World War II was another huge step up in technology. Now you're talking about things like like hydrogen bombs and basically bombs that are big enough to destroy an entire city from across the world. And so now you're getting to this point where global warfare, because of the technology and because of the access to information and travel routes, we're not talking about limited skirmishes on the borders between two countries anymore as being sort of the main way that wars are fought. Now we're talking about millions of people and the ability to kill so many more people at one time with less material, with less human waste. World War I was all about, there was lots of technology, but it was still all about throwing millions and millions and millions of people together in strategic ways in order to try to basically kill as many of the enemy as you could. Whereby as time went on, the technology advanced, and if we look at say today, we've got the U.S. in particular, not Canada so much, but the U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy, but now they rely a lot on autonomous weaponry. So instead of having fighter pilots, which they still have, but instead of having fighter pilots, doing all the flying and controlling the skies and whatnot, well, now they've got people, sitting in bunkers in the U.S. flying planes remotely. So the emphasis has become more on technology used by people, but not including people, to take down enemy cities, to take down battlements, to take down things like that, as opposed to taking 50,000 soldiers and saying, "Hey, go take that place." So World War I is one of the first sort of time periods where this ramp up in technology was significant for the time, and then also because of the advances that were made in the industrial era with regard to transportation. So we're talking about faster trains, we're talking about tanks and armor and faster ships and things that are propelled by engines and controlling the skies. That made it the first really big sort of global event where other nations that weren't close to the initial contact were able to come in and form alliances and start and join the war. So I just want to show. I don't want to go too far down this road because there's lots of materials and I want you to kind of move in order through in order through the material. But I just want to show a couple maps to give you a bit more of an idea about how it started. Now, we went through the causes of World War I in a lot of detail, and your first huge assignment, the one that was worth the vast majority of marks, which I've talked about already, was that MAIN essay that I've received. If you haven't handed that essay, make sure you get it in. It's a big piece that we need to keep moving forward. But I've received several wonderful essays already on it, and hopefully you've been able to understand and use the feedback I've given you on those. We've gone through the causes of World War I, and you should have a really strong understanding of the 4 or 5 main causes, and have argued in that assignment which one you think was the most potent and why the others weren't as important. I mean, that's the whole point of that assignment. But I just wanted to use this time to just give you a bit of an idea of after we know the war has started. Now this is sort of what's happening and why it's happening. So quick overview on that. And then I'll let you go for the day, and I'll maybe switch gears over to History 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to show a battle, or not a battle, a map, sorry. And again, the videos on the Great War series, if you're interested in this, or if you think it'll help with a particular assignment or something, they obviously have multimedia, editing and graphics and CGI and things like that I think makes it more interesting and more engaging. I'm somewhat limited in my ability to incorporate CGI into these sessions of videos. So again, and they've got brilliant historians working on those projects as well. So again, access to information. If you really want an in-depth understanding of what's going on with strong visuals and really backed by expert historians, let's use the resources at our disposal and that YouTube series is a wonderful example of something that's really well put together, really well researched. Anyway, enough of that. So we know what we know the essential causes of the war, and if we're thinking about where the fighting actually started after Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, despite the fact that their ally Germany really didn't want them to go to war. They tried their best in every way, shape, or form to get Austria to say, okay, you need to back off a little bit. These ultimatums that you're giving, they're not going to accept them. And Austria didn't. Those ultimatums to Serbia were made by Austria, knowing full well that they're not going to let the Serbians are not going to let the Australians come in and run their judicial system. That's just not something that a country does if they want to remain sovereign. So Austria gave them those ultimatums, knowing full well that they weren't going to accept them. Austria wanted to go to war. Germany didn't really want to go to war, but they still needed to back up their ally. And we know how it ended, or what happened, right? The Serbians rejected the ultimatums, even though they were okay with like 12 of the 14 ultimatums. The big one, the judicial one, they weren't going to do. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and they are very confident in their ability. Austria, particularly in the early part of the war, were extremely confident in their army and in their commanders. But the reality was, and this view has changed by historians over time, but the reality was, there's a lot of evidence saying that the Austro-Hungarian military commanders, particularly the guy at the top, von Hotzenberg, were relatively inept. There hadn't been a whole lot of military conflict over the last 30 or 40 years that they had been directly involved in. So they had a bunch of military commanders that really hadn't been on a battlefield and weren't able to make good strategic decisions based on what's happening. They were pretty good when it came to looking at maps and deciding where troops should go and that sort of strategy. But when they actually got into the territories and things changed, I think you could talk to anybody who's involved with military, and the first thing they'll tell you is that plans are only good until the first shot is fired, and then you've really got to adapt, and you have to have commanders and military personnel that have been in battles and know how to adapt to the plans based on what's happening right now. You can't just plan it all ahead of time and expect it's going to work. That goes for just about everything in life. Best laid plans, they're good to have, but they're going to change. So what Austria found was they were fighting wars. They were confident in their ability to take Serbia quickly. It's a smaller nation. They're backed by Russia, and Russia's a huge nation, but they figured they could move in and just get this thing done, and then maybe negotiate peace with other nations or whatnot. But they really did want to expand their territory, and the story of the world, right? You want to nations. Nationalism runs rampant in nations, and they want to use imperial power to take over states and to get their way. And Serbia was being a real pain for them. Serbia was a sovereign nation that was very, let's say, politically stubborn, and they weren't about to be taken over by Austria-Hungary, and they were ready to fight. So the Serbians, Serbia was not a particularly rich country, and a lot of their soldiers were conscripted from farms and farmers and things like that. And they had relatively primitive technology when it came to guns and whatnot. I mean, they did have soldiers, but they had a shortage of weaponry because it's a small country and they weren't that wealthy, and they weren't used to fighting large scale global battles. And there were even stories in the videos that I watched and some of the things I've read where soldiers would go to the front line with nothing but a knife, and they would literally have to wait until somebody died in order to get a gun. That's got to be a terrifying way to go to war against an Austrian nation that is reasonably well provisioned. In any case, the Austro-Hungarians are working. They have to both attack Serbia, but they also have to be aware that Russia has a huge land border up here with both Germany and Austria. So they were relying on Germany a lot to both, to defend them in this area here, so that the Russians couldn't just swoop down and take them from this end while they're busying themselves in Serbia. And they intended to take Serbia relatively quickly, but what they didn't really, or what they weren't all that familiar with was fighting on Serbian terrain. The Serbs knew their terrain extremely well, and there was a lot of mountainous regions and rocks and things that made war more difficult for an advancing army and probably a little easier for the Serbs to defend. And the Serbs knew their land very well, so they did a really good job with fewer people defending against the Austro-Hungarians, who I underestimated how much military effort would be required to move into this nation. So there were battles, and they did go back and forth and whatnot. But by this point, Russia is taking a much more active interest in the rule. They're backing Serbia, and alliances have been formed. At this point, Britain is not really all that involved, but France is getting very nervous here. This is just like the first week of the war. So the Germans and German commanders, at this point, Germany is probably the strongest military power. They had well-trained soldiers. They had lots of technology, good technology for weaponry. They had a reasonable population, not so compared to Russia, but they had a reasonable population. They had good rail lines, things like that. So Germany was like a really efficient country, and it was really technologically advanced, and it was probably the biggest power. And they the sources indicate that they didn't really want to go to war, particularly because the alliance of Russia and France and Great Britain left them really exposed. You don't want to fight a two-front war. It's history of warfare. Don't fight a two-front war. Two-front war meaning Germany has to worry about both France on the west and Russia on the east, and that's a huge problem because you got to divide your army. And then if you think about it, well, what's the Great Britain's biggest strength when it comes to war is naval capacity, their ships, their navy. And if you look up north here, now you're worried about the North Sea and all of the British ships in there. So you could really think of it as sort of a three-front war because you're worried about naval attacks up here and provisioning your soldiers and trying to move troops around, to the other side of France and try to surround enemies and things like that. But you've basically got the possibility for Great Britain ruling the seas up here for battles with France on the western border and the battles with Russia on the eastern border. That's not a good recipe for success in any battle, and it's been tried over and over and over again, and it just doesn't work. It's too much. So anyway, we've got Germany and Austria-Hungary. Austria is spending a lot of time in Serbia trying to gain a foothold. It's not going the way they want to. Their troops are realizing that modern warfare is not going in their favor. They're not really equipped to fight in a new age. And even though the Serbs were probably even more backward, for lack of a better term, with what they had at their disposal, they knew their land, and they were fighting very hard to keep their country, and they were fighting using the physical geography of the land much more effectively than the Austro-Hungarians. And another thing that needs to be considered is that at that point, Germany was relatively homogenous population. They were Germans, they spoke German, etc. Whereas Austria-Hungary had many different ethnic groups from territory that they had conquered in the past. So it wasn't like everybody spoke the same language. Not everybody spoke Austria, not everybody spoke Hungarian. There were lots of Slavic nations, Slavic being sort of Russianish, not Russianish, but nations in this area here that had been conquered in the past or overtaken in the past. So Austria-Hungary wasn't as homogenous a culture. There wasn't really just one language and one culture and one way of doing things like there more or less was in Germany. So when it came to assembling the army and making plans and things like that, like those language barriers were quite significant. And there's lots of cases where Austro-Hungarian forces ran into each other, and because they didn't speak the same language, they literally started fighting each other because they didn't realize that it wasn't the Russians that were advancing on them. It was part of their Austro-Hungarian army, but just from an area of Austro-Hungary that they didn't speak Austrian German or Hungarian. Austrian speak German as well. But so that problematic, right? And things that they probably should have known and didn't. So they're fighting in Serbia. They're running into a lot of problems down there. They're having their own problems with supply, and they're having problems with different cultures, different languages. For some reason, I mean, we know why, but Austria-Hungary's rail line was built up of a bunch of different types of railway track. So one type of train couldn't run on all the tracks, and it was a total pain because you'd have troops coming down and weaponry coming down from northern Austria on one set of tracks, but they couldn't divert their path and suddenly go a different direction or they would have to, like, literally, if troops left from northern Austria, and Vienna is way up north, a big city, lots of power there, and we're bringing troops down to fight down here. If things changed and all of a sudden needed to get over here, they would actually have to get all the way down south, get everybody off, get all the equipment off, get on a different type of train, get to here, and then get in a different train, get up there. Like, totally inefficient. Whereas, in Germany, if you're going somewhere on the rail and all of a sudden you need to divert, you just divert because all the tracks are the same. Russia was typically underprepared with regard to mobilizing troops, and we looked into that quite a bit for early in the war, things that were problematic for Russia. But they had actually done a lot of work in the last 2 years and then into the war to improve their rail lines, improve their conditions. So that got significantly better approaching World War I and into World War I. So it was a deficiency for sure that Russia recognized and took care of as quickly as they could. So they had Russian troops mobilizing and so moving troops and moving weaponry toward the battle probably faster than the Germans and Hungarians anticipated they would. So Germany really had a big task on its hands because they wanted to get into France and get France out of the war. The idea was, we got to get France out of the war quickly, and if we can do that, now we're just fighting a one-front war where we really just have to worry about Russia. So Germany was reasonably confident that they could take Paris. Once you take Paris, the nation capital, and that area, you've got a really good foothold to kind of just spread out and make sure that you've got France covered. And then you set up troops along the border of France to make sure that you can't be taken from behind by Britain or Russians coming around or things like that. So that was the goal for Germany. We got to take France. We'll take France quickly, and then we could just make it a one-front war, which we're much more confident about. So the Germans under General Schlieffen had a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. Up here in these nations, usually referred to as the Benelux nations, it's Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg, were typically neutral nations. Belgium in particularly was a neutral nation. They weren't part of either alliance. They didn't want part of the war. Switzerland is often like this too. They're like, don't, we're not calling for any side. Just don't, destroy our nation, because, to be realistic, Germany could have just romped through and taken whatever they wanted in there. But, diplomacy reigned, and Belgium's effectively a neutral nation. But that doesn't mean that they weren't part of the war, because Germany knew that France was going to have a whole lot of troops right on this border here, and that was going to be difficult to take. So the Schlieffen Plan was a plan to basically blitz through Belgium from the north and take Paris as quickly as they could, because if they had a foothold in Paris, essentially they can get France out of the war quickly. So that was the goal. Belgium wasn't about to let them do that, but Belgium didn't really have a choice. And the Germans, there's all sorts of tales of war atrocities here, and also here, and also here, things that, were sort of against the rule of war, killing a lot of civilians, public hangings for anybody that tried to stop an army from moving through, things like that. Basically, lots of terror and killing of women and children, and things that are not generally accepted war rules. And there were rules of war, and there were principles of war. These were dishonorable acts, and there were dishonorable acts on all sides, but it was really potent in those areas in World War I. In any case, Germany did manage to get through, and they did actually manage to get pretty close to their objective. The French did rally and push them back across the Marne River and Aisne River, but then they kind of came to a stalemate. So the Germans pushed through here on the north, but they kept some power here. But they're always worried about what's going to happen over here, because Germany is like, we're out east, far east and far west, and nothing in the middle, which leaves you feeling kind of exposed, right? So they were successful in getting troops through Belgium and down into France. The French did rally and did push them back a little bit, and then they dug in. And this was a major change in World War I, the whole digging in. So this is the advent of trench warfare. So they would dig trenches. A lot of historians have claimed that the spade or the shovel is one of the biggest, the most important weapons in World War I. Typically, the battles had been fought in the plains and above the plains and whatnot, armies advancing toward each other. But now the Germans were digging trenches, zigzag trenches, so you couldn't just get an officer in a trench and then kill a bunch of people in a line. So they make these zigzag trenches by hand, and then set up machine guns so that it was very difficult for anybody to approach. It's very difficult to shoot somebody who's in a hole that you can't see. And it's very easy for a person in a hole with a machine gun to mow down people who are standing on a plane. So the French had to, there was a river, the Rhine River, and the Germans are trenching down and basically digging in on one side of the river, and the French are doing the same thing on the other side of the river, and then not just in the river, in different places where people are digging in, and now there's this referred to as no man's land in between them where you can't really get through it because they'll just gun you down either side. So this is why a war that everybody thought was going to be over by Christmas of 1914 ended up lasting 4 years. I don't think there was a single nation that was involved in the conflict that thought it was going to be a long, drawn-out war. And that's what it turned into, and there's lots of reasons, but this whole sort of idea of trench warfare was one of the major reasons. It really slowed things down. Usually battles were fought in a day or 2 days or a week at most, but now with trenches dug in and people dug in on both sides, now we're talking about battle going consistently day and night for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, things like that, and it just changed the nature of warfare. All right, I've gone into a bit more detail than I wanted to about the opening sort of weeks and months of World War II, but that's World War I. Sorry, that's essentially what's happening here. Early in the war, the British are involved and they are supporting the Allies, but not providing all that many troops. Maybe 100,000 troops, highly trained, really well trained, and really well equipped, but not huge numbers of people. France has an army that has a reasonably large size, but they are a little bit behind the times at the beginning of the war with regard to how war of the future is going to be fought, with regard to defense, with regard to the weaponry, and with regard to things like the camouflaging uniforms. They wore bright blue uniforms that were easy to spot, things like that. They were behind, but they did have good troops, and they were able to sort of hold off in areas they needed to hold off. The Germans are trying to sweep through and take France very quickly. The Germans are very worried about the Russians over here, and there's battles up in this area right here that are starting to happen. And the Russians are bringing many more people to the party, and their technology is behind the times, but starting to improve, and their rail lines are improving, and they're starting to do a better job of mobilizing troops. So Russia is looking at trying to break into Germany here. Germany is trying to defend and maybe gain a little ground there, but Russia also has to bring soldiers down to work with the Serbs down here. Austria-Hungary is very confident they can take Serbia, but they're, frankly, kind of incompetent when it comes to modern military strategy, so they're having way more problems than they should. So that's kind of like 1914 in a nutshell, and we'll go into more detail about that, maybe not as much detail as we go through the war. But the big points are war has changed. Some nations have adapted, some have not. Advances in military technology have made it a very different game with regard to killing people and attacking cities and using the sky and the ocean and under the ocean and rail lines, large guns, that sort of thing has changed the nature of the war and made it easier to kill more people from further distances. And also that the advent of trench warfare slowed down progress significantly compared to wars and battles in the previous, say, 100, 200, 400 years. I think that's a good place to stop today. Again, we might adjust our tack a little bit when it comes to what we're going to be looking at for our Friday session. So just kind of keep posted on the announcements for that. And as always, if you've got any questions, concerns, if you're struggling with the concept or an assignment or a learning material, I'm only an email away, so please let me know. Thank you.